Hi guys, it's Jess from Honest Fiction, and welcome back to my channel. So today, I'm going to be sharing my October wrap-up. Alright guys, so October was a surprisingly good reading month for me. I ended up reading a little more than 20 books, and there's a good mix of fantasy romance, and then just straight romance. And I think I ended up rating most of the books either 4 stars or over, which is definitely more than my average. So yeah, awesome reading month. And I will be sorting this wrap-up, like all my other wrap-ups, by genre. So if you're looking for a certain genre, check the timestamps down below. And with all that out of the way, if you're unfamiliar with my channel, I post new videos every Thursday and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. You can also hit the notification bell to be notified whenever I post new bookish content. You can also check out my Instagram and Goodreads, both linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's talk about the books I read in October. Alright guys, so this first book is kind of like a slight deviation from like my normal content, so we are just gonna get out of the way. So if you follow me on social media, you know that I have been absolutely obsessed with a certain show, and thereby I have now read the corresponding book, and that is Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. So the show is House of the Dragon, hence the shirt I am wearing. So let me start by saying I read The Song of Ice and Fire back when I was in college. I had just seen the first season of Game of Thrones, and I loved it, and I ended up really enjoying that book series. It took me a while to get into George R.R. Martin's writing style. It's pretty dense, but I did really enjoy that series. So, like many of you, I really did not like how Game of Thrones ended up wrapping up. So when this book was announced and released, I wasn't very excited about it, and then when I started reading it, I realized it was nothing like A Song of Ice and Fire. This very much felt like a textbook, and I just didn't care enough about these characters to read it. So then some time went by, House of the Dragon was announced. I didn't really care about House of the Dragon. Like I said, I was kind of nervous about everything that went down with Game of Thrones. I didn't know how I felt about a prequel series, but I watched the premiere, and I enjoyed it. By episode 3, I was completely hooked to this series. Obsession level, I am currently learning High Valyrian via an app. It is the nerdiest thing I've ever done in my life, but I am loving every second of it. So I really enjoyed the first season of House of the Dragon. So while watching it, I ended up deciding to actually read this book. And I will agree with what I said originally. This very much felt like a textbook. The writing is just so different. So we are following all of the different rulers from the Targaryens. Now, we have a bunch of unreliable narrators. So most of the people that are doing like the narrating are different maesters, and then just civilians, and then also Mushroom, and they are all trying to guess how certain things led to these big events. So unless you really care about the Targaryens, I don't know if you're necessarily gonna love this. Like I said, I really enjoyed the Targaryens and their history, and this was still a little bit of a struggle for me. Another thing that people I don't think always realize is that the Dance of the Dragons, which House of the Dragons is based on, is a very small part of this book, and I did not know that going in. So there's only like a few chapters that actually tell you what happens with the Dance of the Dragons. And yeah, so you're actually getting like a much wider view of the Targaryen dynasty. But anyway, do I regret reading it? No. Will I ever reread it? Probably not. It was, like I said, it felt like I was doing homework while I was reading it. So anyway, after I read this, my husband was the best, and he got me the Rise of the Dragon, which is the illustrated edition of Fire and Blood. Oh my goodness, the illustrations are stunning. If you are a fan of the show, I definitely recommend consuming like the story of Fire and Blood via this book. This is just, I'm actually currently rereading it. I didn't realize that this is pretty much Fire and Blood just illustrated. I thought it was kind of its own thing and it had its own content. So far, that doesn't seem to be the case, but definitely if you enjoyed the show, I highly recommend picking up the illustrated edition because it is so good. So anyway, that is all to say that I absolutely loved House of the Dragon, and I cannot wait for the next season to come out, possibly in 2024. All right, so moving into YA fantasy, first up we have One Dark Window, and this is by Rachel Gillig. So this is following Esbeth, and she was born to the town of Blunder. Now, by royal decree, if a child becomes sick in this town and develops a fever, they are actually killed. And that is because the children are becoming sick from dark magic. And once infected with this dark magic, even if they're able to overcome the sickness, as they get older, the magic kind of builds up inside them and it ends up just coming out in very like volatile ways, and they normally end up hurting people without even meaning to, and it's just bad. So the royals have decided that if kids become sick with this, they are just to be killed on sight. So our main character, Elsbeth, ends up being ill as a child. However, her family cares about her and they end up hiding her away. So she actually does recover from her sickness and they think that she is fine. She never developed any magical abilities and they're hoping it was just like a fluke and she's gonna be okay. So one day when Elsbeth is in, I think her like uncle's study, she ends up touching this magical tarot card. So in this world, there are different tarot cards that people can yield and use them to perform magic, and we kind of get into like how this works more in this book. But anyway, she ends up touching this tarot card that has a monster on it, and by touching it, the monster is absorbed into Elsbeth's body. So now Elsbeth has to deal with the fact that there is a monster living inside her, and on top of that, she has to keep it a secret from everyone, because once again, we now know that she has this volatile magic, dark magic, inside of her. So then one day, when Elsbeth is walking through this forest, she runs into a highwayman, and together they are going to try to figure out the secrets of this dark magic, and they work together, and it's a really fun YA fantasy. It also has those like gothic elements. It was the perfect read for October, honestly. And I really enjoyed it, and it was a little bit darker than I was expecting, and the ending definitely ends on like a bit of a cliffhanger, so I can't wait to continue with this series. Now, this particular version is from FairyLoot, and at first, I was a little bit underwhelmed, just because they really didn't change much. That is until I took off the dust jacket. So this is what the naked hardback looks like, and it's actually so dark that like my camera barely picks it up, but it is so cool. I really love it. And then the inside is also absolutely stunning. I love the illustrations on the inside. And then on top of all of this, they also have a reverse dust jacket. So reverse artwork on the dust jacket. So really love FairyLoot's edition of One Dark Window. I think they did a phenomenal job. But yeah, I highly recommend. It was a really enjoyable YA fantasy. Moving into fantasy romance, we have Daughter of No Worlds, and this is by Carissa Broadbent. So this is following Tisana, and at the beginning of the story, she is being sold into slavery and given to these slavers. She is eventually sold to this master who uses her to perform. So Tisana is able to do this very basic performative magic. However, she's not seen as being very powerful. Now, the master that actually ended up buying Tisana isn't unbelievably evil. He is somewhat kind, and he tells her when she is very young that she'll eventually be able to buy her freedom from him. So years go by, and Tisana is eventually able to save up enough money, and when she goes to the master to try to free herself, he loses his cool, and a whole fight breaks out, and she ends up having to flee. Now, she ends up fleeing to this order of kind of like magicians. It's this order of people that are able to do magic, and she's hoping this order will help her go back to the masters and free all of her friends that she had to leave behind. So it's really her story. And there's also a slow burn romance that is also taking place throughout this. So I saw this being pitched as a fantasy romance, and oh my gosh, the romance is so smoldering, and I loved it. Personally, for me, I felt the romance was a little bit lacking, but actually a commenter pointed out that this is very much like a friends to lovers romance, and I think that's my issue with it. I'm not a huge fan of friends to lovers. I like a little bit more like enemies to lovers and angst, and I didn't get that with this. This was a very original story, and I honestly loved Tisana as a main character. I thought she was very strong, and she really wanted to do what's best for her people. So like I said, she is able to free herself pretty early on in the story, but still, she is just thinking about the people that she left behind, and I did love that about her. So I do plan on continuing with this series, probably not until December, and I did enjoy this, just not quite as much as I was expecting to. And next up, I read River of Shadows, and this is by Karina Halle. So I'm still not exactly sure how I feel about this book. I think I ended up enjoying it more than I was expecting. However, there are still parts that I have really big issues with. So this is following our main character. At the start of her story, we find out that her father has passed away. Now, her and her father have been estranged, so she ends up traveling to Finland where he lives, And right when she gets there, she starts noticing that some things are amiss. The person that picked her up seems to have like antlers in certain lighting, and she ends up passing out as soon as she gets in this person's car. And then it's just obviously there are some issues and things going on. So when she finally gets to where her father's body is, she goes, looks in the casket, and there's no body. So she starts thinking that something has gone wrong. And then her father's apprentice shows up and says, hey, we gotta get out of here. Those people wanna kill you. I know where your father is. He's actually a shaman, and he went to the underworld because he had cancer. So that is pretty much where our story starts off. And then from there, it's really our main character traveling to the underworld to try to find her father. And then the second half of this book, really the entire tone of the book kind of changes. And I don't even want to say what happens because I feel like that is a huge spoiler. But like I said, this is fantasy romance, so I think you guys can kind of figure out what happens when she meets the primal of death. And it becomes almost like a Beauty and the Beast retelling, which just felt so different from the first half of the book that felt more like an adventure, and we were setting up for this like epic trek through the Shadowlands in order to find her father, and the second half felt very like Beauty and the Beast, like I said. So overall, I did enjoy this, and I just found out the sequel has already been released, so I will definitely be continuing with this series. I just feel like there could have been a little bit more editing in this book to make it like flow a little bit more smoothly, but overall, it was still an enjoyable read, and if you enjoy fantasy romance, you will probably really enjoy this. All right, so moving into paranormal romance, obviously it's October. I read a decent amount of paranormal romance, and I just fell in love with this genre. So first up, I read Heathens, and this is by Nicole Fiorina. So this is the author that wrote the Stay With Me series, which is one of my absolute favorite romance series of all time. So I was so excited to listen to this when it finally came out via audio, and it did not disappoint. So this is following Fallon, and at the start of the story, Fallon's father has passed away, and we find out that Fallon really has no family left besides her grandfather, who she's never met. So her grandfather actually lives in, I believe it's Weeping Hollow, it might be a different name, but that is the town she was born into, and her grandfather has been corresponding with her via letters, but they never actually met. Until one day, Fallon gets a letter from her grandfather saying, hey, I'm very ill, I need someone to help take care of me, would you be willing to travel back to your hometown to stay with me? So Fallon realizes that she has no ties to the community, and why not? So she travels to see her grandfather, and when she gets there, right away, she realizes that something's up. Her grandfather was not expecting her. He actually seems angry at the fact that she's here back in her hometown, and then she meets this mysterious boy who is wearing a mask, and right away, she is intrigued. So we find out that this mysterious boy is actually Julian, and he is part of the Heathens. We also find out that this entire town is comprised of different witch covens, and the story really goes from there. So the one thing I will say about this book is all the witchy vibes you could want. This is just all vibes. So I really love the whole gothic setting. I loved the witchiness of this book. This was just so good. And also the romance between Fallon and Julian was great. It was so off the charts in terms of like sexual tension and also like forbidden love. It really gave me like Romeo and Juliet vibes because this entire town does not want these two people to be together, and despite this, they are just trying their best to be in a relationship, and I really enjoyed it. So I highly recommend. There is supposed to be a sequel. I feel like they've been talking about a sequel for a while. So when the sequel is released, I will be reading it. I cannot wait. I really love this world and I love these characters, and Nicole Fiorina can really do no wrong. Moving on, next up we have Her Soul to Take by Harley LaRoux, and I was so nervous to start this book because it has gotten so many mixed reviews. All I knew was it was a spicy demon romance. It did not disappoint. It is spicy and it is a demon romance, and I absolutely loved it. So we were following Ray, and Ray in terms of appearance is essentially Velma from Scooby-Doo. And she ends up moving back to her hometown to go to college. Now, Ray is obsessed with the paranormal. She actually has a YouTube channel where she's a ghost hunter, and she's just really into everything that has to do with the occult. So one day when Ray is like going through this library, she finds a book. This book happens to be a grimoire. So she takes it home, and then she ends up like going through her day, and like she ends up bumping into this guard at the college. This guard is Leon. We learn that Leon is actually a demon summoned from hell by this cult that lives in her hometown. So Leon is very interested in Ray because Ray is not afraid of him, and humans typically, even though he's disguised as this very handsome individual, can like sense that there is a demon in their presence and try to like stay away. Ray does not do that, so he kind of takes an interest in her. So the cult actually tasks Leon to kill Ray, and Leon is like, nah, I'm not gonna do it. So then a few days goes by, and Ray is like playing with this book she finds, and she realizes it's actually a grimoire, and she realizes it's a grimoire to summon a demon. And like I said, she is a ghost hunter, so she decides she is going to record herself summoning a demon. And when she summons the demon, it turns out to be Leon, and it is their story. So Leon and Ray pretty much have to work together to stop this cult from trying to kill Ray, and thereby summon this like Cthulhu type monster. And it was just so much fun and so much creepier than I was expecting. So there are these like horrible monsters, and they're described in like a decent amount of detail that like it was creepy, and I loved it, and I loved the romance. It also kind of has like a BDSM feel. Ray is really into being like submissive, while Leon is very dominant, and I enjoyed this so much more than I thought I was. So I will definitely be reading the second book. I already downloaded the audio, or I pre-ordered the audio. It hasn't been released at the time I'm filming this, but I just cannot wait to read the second book, and it should be really fun. So definitely, if you want a demon romance, I highly recommend Her Soul to Take. And then I read Court of the Vampire Queen by Katie Robert. So here's the deal with this book. I think if you go into this book knowing that it is essentially vampire erotica, you're gonna have a great time. Luckily, I did know that going in, and I actually enjoyed the plot. So we're following this girl who is part vampire, but her father really hates her, and we really don't understand why. So her father ends up giving her to this very old vampire. So this old vampire can use her for like blood and breeding purposes. So right away, she is just very unhappy. She doesn't want to do this, and she's just been very leery of vampires because they've treated her so terribly. So when she is given to this vampire, he ends up sucking her blood, but then some spicy time happens, and they end up being in a relationship. And then another vampire enters into the mix, and then another person, and it kind of just goes from there. And then we find out that there's a little bit more about our main character than anyone thought originally, and I don't know what to say without giving away spoilers, but what I didn't realize going into this is that this is actually 3 different novellas that are put together in one bind-up. So it was good. I enjoyed it. I think that if you like vampire smut and if you're familiar with Katie Roberts' writing, you will probably very much enjoy this. Like I said, you just have to know what you're getting into going into it. And next I read Wolf Gone Wild by Juliette Cross. So I've been seeing a lot of people talking about this series, and I just never picked it up. And then I was looking for some shifter romances, and I figured I'd give it a try, and I really enjoyed it. So we were following Mateo, and he is a werewolf. However, for some reason, he has not been able to transform into his wolf for, I think it's like 6 months at the start of the story, and this is really eating him up inside because his wolf wants out. So it's almost like Mateo has like dual personalities. His wolf is trying to like kind of take over his mind, is constantly talking to him. So Mateo realizes that he needs to find a witch to help break the hex that must have been put on him. So he ends up meeting Evie, and luckily for Mateo, Evie is like the queen of breaking hexes, along with her sisters who are also part of this witch coven. Now, this witch coven doesn't normally work with werewolves because they are seen to have kind of like anger issues, but Evie really takes a liking to Mateo, and eventually they start a relationship, and it's really them just trying to break the hex on Mateo. And I really loved the humor in this book way more than I was expecting. I feel like with rom-coms, sometimes the jokes just kind of fall flat, and I don't typically love rom-com type books, but this one I actually found myself laughing out loud multiple times. And also the steamy scenes are really good, and I was not expecting the twist at the end, so I cannot wait to continue with this series. I think the new book just came out or is about to come out, and that's about a couple that I am like most interested in, so I have to get through the series really fast to get to that book. But anyway, I highly recommend if you want a really good shifter romance. And last up for paranormal romance is Sanctum by Mcbride. So this is following Skye, and Skye is an Omega in this very abusive werewolf pack. So in this particular werewolf pack, Omegas are seen as almost like prostitutes. They're there just to service the other members of the pack. And Skye's mother has actually been doing this for Skye's entire life. Now, luckily for Skye, you don't begin doing your like duties as an Omega until you turn 18, and Skye is only 17 at the start of this book. So although she's not an official Omega, she still is being bullied in school. The boys are like taunting her, saying they can't wait for her to come of age, and she still has to see her mother and the other members of the Omegas just going through these horrible things. So everything becomes way worse when the alpha of the pack dies and Sky's uncle ends up becoming the new alpha, and on his first day of being a new alpha, he ends up changing the law of the age requirement. So now the age requirement to become an alpha is going to be only 17, which is the age that Sky is. So the next day, she's going to start having to perform her Omega duties. And her mother says that this can't happen, they are going to flee. So before they're even able to start fleeing, another very traumatic event happens, and then Sky and her mother do eventually escape this pack. So they go to the Blackwater pack. Now, the Blackwater pack is led by Gabriel, who's just a very kind alpha, and he really makes sure to take care of his people. And he also sends the younger students to this high school that I think is a few states away, and they all kind of get to like meet other members of like different packs and commingle, and it's supposed to like help unity, yada yada. So anyway, our main character Sky ends up being sent to this high school, and she starts to like learn about the world. She doesn't know about Netflix, she doesn't know about grocery stores just because she's lived such a terrible life. And she ends up having some new friends, and it just kind of is her day to day. And then she meets Remy, and Remy is the soon-to-be alpha of the Blackwater pack. He's Gabriel's son, and they have this instant connection, and the story kind of goes from there. So I did not know when I was going into this book, or I found out right before I started this book is actually YA, young adult. I am not sure if I agree with that. I feel like the beginning of this book is very dark. Like I was describing, there are some terrible things that our main character sees and has to go through. She is dealing with SA pretty much most of this book. And it is following a younger character. So I feel like, yes, it is YA because our main character, our protagonist, is 17, but also just know going into it, this is like super dark. So I wouldn't let younger readers read this story. Now, did I enjoy this? Heck yes, I bought the entire series like right after I finished this first book. This book felt so much like Twilight, and I didn't know I needed a book that felt like Twilight as a 30-year-old, but apparently I do. This gave me all of the Fated Mates Twilight vibes that I could possibly want, and I just absolutely loved it. I was hooked. So I listened to the audio for the first book and the second book. The audio has yet to be released for the third book. I contacted the author. She said sometime next year. So I probably will end up just reading the third book physically, but if you want a werewolf romance that is dark and angsty and gives you all of the Twilight feels, I highly, highly recommend picking up Sanctum. All right, so moving into romance, and we're going to start with dark romance. And this is about as dark as it gets. We have the Enslaved Duet by Giana Darling. So this is actually a bind-up of 2 books, and this is following Cosima Lombardi. So Cosima is this beautiful young girl. She is an aspiring model, and her father ends up selling her to Lord Alexander Thornton to pay off his gambling debts. So Alexander takes Cosima, he chains her to his ballroom floor, treats her terribly, and makes her become his sex slave. So we eventually find out that Lord Thornton is actually part of this secret society of very powerful men who all have these sex slaves. So, like I said, super dark. We do find out that Cosima is kind of eventually into everything that Lord Thornton is doing, and they do eventually develop a relationship. And then some things happen, and I really can't even go more into that because it's going to give away spoilers. But I will say I definitely enjoyed the first book a little bit more than the second book. I feel like the second book is it's a little bit more action-packed, and we have a decent time jump from the first book, and I'm not sure how much I enjoyed that. But Cosima and Lord Thornton's relationship is so good. It might be one of my favorite relationships written by Giana Darling, and I love the anti-heroes and love duet, but I feel like the chemistry between Cosima and Lord Thornton might actually be better than that book. So highly recommend if you enjoy super dark romance, I think you will very much enjoy this duet. All right, and moving into contemporary romance, I read A Million Kisses in Your Lifetime. So this book had been on my radar for a while. The audio was finally released in the beginning of October, and I didn't realize this was a high school romance. However, I did enjoy it. So we're following these 2 students that are very rich and are going to this prep school. It kind of reminded me of like Magnolia Parks. So our one main character is Ren, and she is the epitome of just a good girl. She wears a promise ring. She gets like all of her schoolwork done. She dresses very conservatively, and she doesn't really judge her friends for sleeping around, but like low-key kind of does. And then you have Crew, whose father actually owns this prep school, so he's unbelievably wealthy. All the other students think he's able to do whatever he wants to do, and he's just kind of seen as like a bad boy. So Ren does not like Crew. Crew wants to take Ren's virginity, and it kind of like goes from there. They end up being assigned to work together in partners for this class where they have to get to know one another. And I did enjoy this. I was not expecting to like a high school romance, like I said, and I will never look at Blow Pops the same way. For those of you who have read the book, you know what I'm talking about. That scene was interesting, but I did really like just the drawn out, like slow tension of like having a high school relationship and being nervous. When are they gonna call and like things like that. So overall, I did really enjoy it. I think it definitely is worth all the hype it was getting a while ago. But I think it was really fun, and I look forward to reading more from this author. And last up for contemporary romance, I read 2 books by Colleen Hoover. So first up we have It Ends With Us. This is my favorite Colleen Hoover book. It deals with domestic violence, and it's just, I love this book so, so much. So I read this to prepare for reading It Starts With Us, which was released recently. And I have thoughts. I did enjoy this book. I'm going to keep this completely spoiler-free. So first of all, I didn't realize that this was a sequel to It Ends With Us. I thought this was going to be actually like a prequel. So that I was kind of shocked by. But also, this ends up taking place right after where It Ends With Us leaves off. And while I do love the characters and I do love the direction this book went, I feel like there wasn't enough of an actual story. This really felt like an extended epilogue, and I just wanted a little bit more. So I can't really say the 2 stories I'm discussing, but one of our main characters is dealing with a co-parenting relationship and the struggles of having to go through that. And then another one of the characters discovers that he has a brother that he didn't know about and is trying to kind of figure out a way to take care of him, but also figure out like a custody situation. So I feel like both of those stories were great, but I just needed more from both of those stories, or just focus on one. I just didn't get enough from either. And I feel like every other Coho book, even the books that I haven't like absolutely loved, I've still cried. This woman is amazing at making me tear up. And I really didn't cry at all with this book. Like, I was very happy to see the characters. I just wasn't emotionally invested like I was hoping to be. So I think that if you loved It Ends With Us, you should still read It Starts With Us. It's really good to see these characters again. But overall, this was a little bit of a letdown for me. All right, guys, those are all the books I read in October. Please let me know down in the comments below if you have read any of the books I mentioned. And I said this already, I post new videos every Thursday and Sunday. And if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. I will see you all next week. Bye.